Welcome, everyone. I'm Gabriela Salinas, Managing Director of Brand Finance Institute, the Educational and Training Division of Brand Finance, which offers world-class executive training on brand strategy and valuation. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We have people from over 15 countries. Today's webinar will focus on soft power. We will unpack how it's defined, how it contributes to nations' prosperity and success, how we can measure its impact rigorously, and the nations that we can consider soft power leaders. We at Brand Finance have created the Global Soft Power Index, incorporating the most extensive market research ever conducted on the topic. And today, alongside with the results of the study, we will outline our methodology centered around a survey of over 55,000 people, which includes general public and specialist audiences from over 100 countries. The webinar will conclude with a discussion on how different ways in which governments manage the pandemic might impact soft power ahead of our next wave of research this autumn. The online discussion will be led by Steve Thompson, Inside Director at Brand Finance, and Parul Soni, Associate at Brand Finance. Just a quick note on housekeeping, the session will be interactive, incorporating real-time surveys. The format of the hour-long webinar today will follow a 40-minute presentation by Steve and Parul, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. You can submit your questions to our presenters through the Q&A tool. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar after the session. Also, if you would like to access our Global Soft Power Index, please check our website or the link we're sharing now in the chat box. We also kindly request that upon leaving the webinar, you fill out the brief survey providing feedback that will be helpful to develop future webinars. Finally, I would like to encourage all of you to engage with us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, using the hashtag SoftPower and the Brand Finance handle @BrandFinance on Twitter. So, without further ado, Steve, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Gabby, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on the fascinating and important topic of soft power. Now, it's important because, as you will see, soft power has a significant impact on the decisions that people, organizations, and governments make, the outcomes for nations and businesses. As Joseph Nye, who's the real godfather of soft power, puts it, it's a means to success. Fascinating? Well, I think it is. And it is fascinating to see the perceptions that different people have around the world about different nations, their strengths and their challenges. We've learned a lot about the real powers of persuasion and attraction that different countries possess, as well as seeing who the underperformers are, with the potential to raise their game and deliver tangible benefits to national well-being. And although we can only really speculate at the moment, of course, we are itching to find out how COVID-19 will impact global perceptions of different nations, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. But what do we mean by soft power? Firstly, we started with an extensive review of academic literature and other information, including the pioneering work of Harvard professor Joseph Nye. And we boiled everything down to the definition that you can see on your screen here. And this is our definition of soft power. A country's ability to influence the preferences and behaviors of various actors in the international arena, states, corporations, communities, publics, etc., through attraction or persuasion rather than coercion. So we're talking about influence, attraction, and persuasion. And if you're involved at all in brand marketing, you'll understand that these are classic elements of brand strength and brand equity. And indeed, Brand Finance has been evaluating nation brand strength and producing nation brand valuations for 15 years now. So it was a natural step for us to extend our evaluation approach into the realm of soft power. So, having extensively researched the theoretical foundations of global soft power, we then set out to measure it. So if you're going to measure soft power and determine who's got it and who doesn't, we needed some kind of framework, a model, if you like, which encompasses all the key dimensions of soft power. Now, Joseph Nye boils it down to three elements: culture, political values, and foreign policies. But our approach is a little bit broader and a bit more nuanced. As you can see on the chart here, our model has a little bit more complexity to it. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see three key overall measures, KPIs, which we believe are important and universal indicators of soft power. Familiarity, that's one of them. That's a basic entry point. If people know more about your country and its talents, its businesses and resources, then your soft power is enhanced. Now, reputation, that's clearly important. If for a nation to be attractive and a role model for others, then its overall reputation must be strong and positive. So, and those two are fundamental to brands too, familiarity and reputation. The third of our KPIs is more of a direct measure of the perceived presence and impact that other countries have in your country, and that's how we measured that. And it's a great way of assessing whether soft power really plays out globally, or whether some nations' soft power is restricted to certain regions, or whether they have strong cultural affiliations, for example. So that's our KPIs. Then in addition, on the right, our desk research highlighted 7 specific dimensions or pillars of soft power. Yes, culture and foreign policy are important, as Joseph and I pointed out, but so too are dimensions such as the nation's educational and scientific resources. Then there's the reach of and influence of a country's media. And of course, from a business sense, having a favorable business climate is clearly an attractive asset if you want other countries to trade and invest with you. Having devised our framework, we then set out to develop our soft power index based, as Kpis said, on the largest market research program ever conducted, actually the largest I've ever been involved in over 40 years now in market research. And the 2 key principles of our approach were, firstly, we wanted to get the views both of ordinary people and the opinions of experts who see soft power in action close up and who really can see that it has real impact on outcomes and decisions. So we covered both populations. And secondly, we wanted a genuinely global measure. We weren't satisfied with a survey covering just 20 or 25 big countries. If you look at a country like China and its Belt and Road Initiative, it's reaching into many smaller nations in the developing world. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at old world powers such as Britain or France, they still retain a degree of soft power and influence in many of their former colonies. And if you ignore these factors and only focus on what the developed world thinks, you're going to get an incomplete picture of soft power. So our research program gathered responses from people in over 100 countries, including a survey of the general public in 87 markets, over 50,000 people in all, including the views of people in countries often overlooked in this kind of exercise. People from Guyana, Senegal, Honduras, Kuwait, Uzbekistan, Ethiopia. And complementing that was a survey of 1,000 experts we call specialist audiences, people in academia, media, business leaders, government, NGOs, and so on. Parul?
Now, we can all appreciate the link between soft power and nation brand. Soft power perceptions form a key component in the overall measurement of a nation's brand strength. If, according to our definition, soft power is the ability to influence actors, a nation brand and what it stands for puts that ability into practice. A similar mutually beneficial relationship exists for nation brands and the corporates that originate from and associate themselves with that nation. On one hand, a country's nation brand facilitates location branding, which encompasses nation, region, and city branding, through which both local as well as global businesses strive to create visual, emotional, and perceptual connections with locations in order to market their products and services. The concept stems from the idea that places evoke strong emotional connections that are highly effective in conveying characteristics and perceptions that are associated with the location. We see this very evidently with German manufacturers, automobile manufacturers that regularly leverage this nation's reputation in the field to differentiate their cars. On the other hand, location branding also creates a symbiotic relationship between the two, where the corporate brands act as brand ambassadors for the nation on the world stage. as is the case for Singapore Airlines, which has now become an iconic brand ambassador for the nation. The airline's heritage, history, and branding are all deeply rooted in the nation's identity. And this is quite evident in their marketing that frequently features both local elements, which can in itself be considered both an advertisement for the airline as well as a tourism campaign for the nation. Similarly, this relationship is also true for geographic indication products, in particular food products. So think Cornish pasties, Stilton cheese, or Scotch whisky. A 2019 study by Brand Dialogue, PR agency part of the Brand Finance Group, on British geographical indication brands validates this view that location branding can drive positive perceptions about products. The study shows that GI brands fare much better with British consumers, and that nearly 3 in 4, or 75% of British consumers, believe that they're more likely to purchase products with a geographical indication. The same is true for global well-known brands like Parmigiano Reggiano, which consistently command price and volume premiums on the market. For a nation's overall economy, its soft power also has a direct impact on attracting foreign investment. Based on our analysis of the nation's soft power score and net to FDI inflows, the two are very closely correlated. So the higher the soft power score is, the higher the net foreign direct investment inflows are into the country.
So experts agree that soft power delivers all kinds of benefits for nations and its people and businesses, all shapes and sizes. We tend to think of soft power as, focusing on a nation's success on the global stage, but it's often overlooked that a strong national brand and soft power can also deliver better outcomes at home. For example, by encouraging domestic tourism, consumption of domestic goods and services rather than imports, and less tangibly, just making people feel better about their country and where they live. But of course, most of the benefits of soft power accrue in the sphere of international relations and trade. Parola's mentioned FDI as an obvious benefit, that if you're attractive as a place to invest in, then that investment will flow. And similarly for tourism, if you're a country that looks interesting, rich culture, friendly people, of course people are more likely to want to visit you. In terms of business and trade generally, it's helpful to be a strong soft power country with a vibrant business climate, businesses that are successful and therefore ones you want to partner with, and so on and so forth. And then more broadly, the political influence and the success of your international partnerships are all enhanced if you're seen as a strong, reliable partner with attractive properties and basically have that intangible asset called soft power. So it's clearly worth having. As Joseph Nye puts it, from a governmental standpoint, failure to incorporate it in national strategy is a serious mistake. Those are his words, not ours. But what specifically can and should governments and other large organizations do to assess and improve their soft power credentials? Well, the starting point with any kind of brand evaluation is to use soft power measurement to diagnose your nation's strengths and weaknesses. Basically, you can't really then do anything about setting your strategic priorities until you know where you stand. But once you do know that, then it's a case of starting to figure out what kind of improvements and priorities you need to set with your policies. We're seeing this, for example, in the Middle East. Typically, many Middle Eastern nations don't have particularly strong reputations in the fields of education and science. And many of them now are recognizing that that's a weakness that has to be addressed, both in terms of the actions they're taking to strengthen their resources, but also communicate exactly what kind of actions are being taken in that part of the world. Now, then we have benchmarking and accountability, and that's obviously important to ensure that these kinds of investments and projects do deliver tangible returns, and to avoid white elephant or vanity projects, which might look good in some quarters, but actually don't really deliver anything in terms of soft power and reputational gain. And another key application of this kind of thinking concerns communication and education. In some cases, soft power may be constrained because of poor communication of a nation's strengths and resources. And what a wasted opportunity that is. You're actually doing very good things, but nobody knows about it. It's often fixable with the right communication strategy, but only with a good understanding of your existing reputation and brand equity and the misperceptions that need to be corrected through that. But it's not just governments who need to think about soft power. A nation's attractiveness and soft power will impact most brands and businesses. And that's especially the case with for those with very clear national origins and associations, as Parul mentioned. So what should businesses and brands be doing about soft power? Well, most obviously, strong soft power clearly benefits any brand associated with a nation's expertise and a positive reputation, either overall or in specific fields like science, creative industries, food, engineering, whatever. So brands firstly need to assess what their nation brings to the table in terms of enhancing their own brand reputation or not. Parul gave the example of German auto, and that's a really very clear one where to emphasize that those German strengths clearly benefits brands from that country. There may be instances where soft power isn't necessarily pulling in your direction, and that's a signal maybe that you need to, at least in the short term, emphasize your brand's global credentials rather than national origin. You're seeing Turkish Airlines a good example of that at the moment, for example. That's kind of brand positioning and strategy, but there's a broader business strategy which soft power is a big provides great insight into. Clearly, if you're thinking about where to invest, where to source particular components or ingredients, or targeting your own business expansion, then soft power analysis can provide a great deal of insight. But even if you say, hang on a minute, really soft power is all about government policy, we would say, hang on a minute, businesses still need to ascertain what they can do to try and influence government policy and say, hey, government, help us. We're trying to expand in another part of the world, and we're pushing water uphill because of the poor reputation of our country. But also businesses can help government. It should be a collaborative, cooperative arrangement where both business and government work together to improve their nation's soft power.
Now, let's shift our attention to some of the results from the Global Soft Power Study. Before we dig in, I would just like to tell you about our interactive dashboard of results on our website, where you can view all of the results for your country in a lot more detail. So this demo on the screen shows you some of the features on the dashboard. You can access it using the link you see at the bottom of the screen and navigate to Global Soft Power Index under the Nation Brands tab. Once you're here, you can view the rankings for the index and the pillars within it. You can also navigate to focus on a particular region and see how your nation ranks within your region on any particular pillar. We then have an Insights View tab where you're able to play around with some of the results and see how different metrics interact with each other, as well as other factors like the size of the country by population or GDP and what impact that has on the various metrics that are measured. The third view is the country view, where you can see detailed results for all nations. You can see how the country scores amongst the two audience groups, the general public versus specialists. You can also see how it does within each metric within the pillar and the rankings for those. Another element that we've recently added is the functionality to be able to view results by region and country of respondent. So for example, you can see how respondents in Asia rate the US, or dive even deeper to see how respondents in Indonesia view the US, and maybe compare that to how respondents in Japan view them. So feel free to explore this in your own time. There are so many fascinating insights on there, but for now, we will share with you what we can briefly cover in this session. So if we look at the top 10 nations, the US has come out on top with a significant margin. It has high levels of familiarity, strong perceived influence, has a largely positive reputation, and comes out strong on multiple different pillars. Liberal Western democracies in general are dominating top ranks. Germany, for example, is traditionally strong in business and technology. Its leading position in the EU also demonstrates its significant influence in international affairs. Their stability in economy and politics also sets a solid foundation for their soft power. The UK's soft power practice balances a variety of different metrics. It has a rich culture, although it's not quite comparable to the top tier tourism destinations. It has a good education system, but it never really outperforms on technology. However, consistently healthy performance on all aspects of soft power builds up to its high ranking in our study. China, on the other hand, challenges the Western nations with a 5th place ranking based on a high perceived influence. China's sheer size and increasing confidence on the world stage gives it undoubted influence. Its enthusiastic embrace of capitalism has also led to great strength in business and trade, as well as education and science. And then again, if we look at Japan, it has an excellent reputation, and its strength in leading edge technology and business also demonstrates its significant influence in the world. It has a unique culture and excellent governance, which makes Japan a high-ranking nation. As Steve mentioned, soft power is also not just about overall influence. We've identified 7 pillars or areas of influence where soft power is exercised by different nations. Within this, the US leads on media, education, and science. France is a leader on culture and heritage with a high ranking in a most loved cuisine, an appealing lifestyle, and as well as being a tourism hub. Canadians are seen as likable people, topping the rankings in terms of people and values. They're widely recognized as being the most generous. Japan's high overall ranking is also attributable to perceptions of being a nation that's efficient, stable, and also easy to do business with. With a variety of different metrics that encompass soft power, every country can aspire to be a soft power medalist. There are 19 different nations which have excelled in at least one niche area within our study. And within this, the US has come out in pole position with the most number of medals overall.
So let's briefly look at some other themes that have emerged from our research. We've only got time to touch on these briefly, of course, but we're going to talk a little bit about the performance of the BRICS. You know, growing in terms of economic success and influence over the last 10 years, but have they got the soft power perhaps that they were hoping to have had by now? We'll talk in particular about China as clearly of the BRICS, the one that's most in the spotlight these days, and I think for decades to come. I'd also like to talk about a couple of other dimensions. One is the issue of mental availability. I'll come back to that in a bit, but also the ability within our research to look at how other countries see you compared to how people in your own country see yourselves. So comparing your view versus our view, if you like. Again, I'll come back to that in a little while. First, let's talk about the BRICS. So, I mean, really, for the last decade, there's been a lot of focus on the BRICS. But in a research note published last October by S&P Global Ratings, they pointed out really that the diverging long-term economic trajectory of these 5 countries is started to undermine the idea that the BRICS really are a coherent economic grouping. Yes, China and India have had very strong economic performance in the past decade or two, but that's not necessarily the case for the other 3. And I think we're seeing that same kind of divergence, not just in terms of economic power, but also soft power. Yes, as Parol's pointed out, China is the rising star. It's undoubtedly got very, very strong influence. They're investing very heavily in terms of soft power as well as hard and economic power. It's got a bit of a mixed reputation, as you'll see, but it's in our top 5 and it's going to stay there, I would think. Russia is the other top 10 nation of the 5 BRICS. That's really based what I would call a more like a 20th century kind of soft power platform. strong presence in international affairs. It's been a world player, obviously, for a long time now, and that reputation and influence is enduring. The remaining three really more kind of mid-table performers, you might say. And I think even looking at the overall economic size and international presence that these 5 countries have, you'd still say arguably together, they are really underperformers. And one of the reasons, I think, is that their performance is a little bit undermined by what you might say is a bit of a mixed reputation internationally. None of these 5 countries rank in our top 20 on our reputation measure. And generally, as you can see on this chart, there is a correlation between reputation and influence. It's very hard, for example, if you are a country with a very poor reputation, to have much influence at all. You're clearly no kind of role model, and people are not looking to you for either leadership or advice, nor are your countries particularly attractive in terms of a destination for investment, tourism, or other trade. So no question, a better reputation would help any of our 5 BRICS or any nation for that. But while China would undoubtedly benefit from a more positive reputation, we shouldn't conclude that China is seen negatively around the world and that the whole world is suspicious or nervous about China. Now, for sure, the reputation is okay, but it's not bad. It's mid-table amongst our specialists. And in some parts of the world, the reputation is actually quite positive, particularly many parts of Africa and Asia. And we also had a very specific question asked of all the nations in there. You'll see it is in the dashboard, where we asked, do you feel on balance the impact of this country is positive or negative, mixed or neutral? And you can see that for China, whilst there's a lot of people saying, frankly, it's a bit mixed, that on balance, it's more positive than negative. So we should not conclude that China is seen negatively around the world and that its soft power and growing soft power is necessarily seen as a bad thing by many of our general public or experts. Now, while we might underestimate the reputation of some countries like China, we also see another kind of mismatch. And that's often between the global perceptions of a nation and how the people of that country see themselves. This your view, our view that I mentioned earlier. And on this chart, we're seeing the gap here between how the world sees a particular country and how the citizens of that country see themselves. You can see that the perceptual gap is generally biggest for smaller nations, ones that aren't necessarily that familiar to people in all parts of the globe. So for countries like, say, New Zealand or the Nordic countries, the people in who live in those countries think, well, we know we run a pretty good ship here. We are very well developed. We have a great standard of living, a good quality of life, good institutions, and so on. But in far-flung parts of the globe a long way from these countries, people don't necessarily know that. They don't have negative opinions, but they maybe have less positive ones. They're not so sure. And it's definitely a problem that smaller nations are more likely to have. But looking at the perceptual gaps in more detail, not just overall, but on particular dimensions, that's where it gets really revealing. And this is a chart just about the UK, looking at the worldview of the UK on the x-axis and on the y-axis, how the UK sees itself. Now, there is some alignment and agreement on certain things where, both the world and the UK itself sees a strong, stable economy on the whole, successful one. It's a good educational system. It's a great place to visit. We're all in agreement on that. And at the other end, there's some agreement on where we need to improve. We shouldn't be too surprised, I guess, that nobody thinks British food is the best in the world. I think what was particularly interesting for us is the one on trustworthy media, where I think there's there's often been some perception that somehow British media, led by the BBC, is the most trustworthy in the world. Actually, the world doesn't see that, neither do Brits themselves. And we might say, well, hang on a minute, what about the BBC? But I think internationally, people see British media beyond the BBC in any case. Whether you like the BBC or not, there is other dimensions to British media, and the verdict on British media is, sure enough, it's influential, but trustworthy, the jury's out. But then there are some dimensions where there's a real kind of mismatch, and these are the ones really that Brand GB needs to think about, because if you like, we're probably overrating ourselves in some of these dimensions. We think we're stronger than the world thinks in terms of things like science and technology, and that may be reality, or it may be a communication issue we need to assess. Similarly, in terms of another one that we picked out is the degree to which we're seen as a generous international player. You know, we actually contribute a fairly sizable percentage of our GDP to foreign aid. And not surprisingly, many Brits who are aware of that think, you know, we are generous. But that generosity isn't necessarily seen or appreciated around the world. This is something that Brand GB needs to address. But we've been talking a bit about reputation quite a bit, but soft power is more than reputation, as we've said. And there are a couple of other of our key metrics, if we go back to those, which we need to think about. If we revisit those, we can see we have the issues of familiarity and overall influence. And these are to some extent a factor of scale and salience. How big is that country? Do I care about it? Am I interested in what's going on there? Maybe because it's a near neighbor or somewhere I have a cultural affinity to. And together, these are broadly comparable to the concept of mental and physical availability, which is a known driver of commercial brand growth and success. Brands with strong mental and physical availability have an advantage. They come to mind when you're thinking about purchasing things from there or investing there, considering best practice, sources of advice and guidance, and so on and so forth. You can't get away from that. We're talking about power, and that mental and physical availability is important. And certain countries have it and some don't. As with brands, bigger countries typically have much stronger mental availability as a matter of course. You're thinking of beer, I bet most of you have heard of Budweiser, rather fewer, I should think, Karlovačko, which is a Croatian beer, and it's the same for countries too. The US is undoubtedly the leader in terms of mental availability. Reality is that the US culture, brands, people, and values have a real kind of star quality to them. And even some of the less popular aspects of the US, Trump himself perhaps, they're still a source of fascination. And this kind of brand fame, you can't buy it very easily. I think the English language definitely helps, and hence the high ranking of the UK on this dimension. Though for the UK, I think the royal family also undoubtedly makes a contribution, which is something Brand Finance has consistently said. But in contrast, you get many smaller countries which really have to fight to get noticed globally. So if we look at a couple of examples, we actually, I think, speculated before we did the research that Singapore and New Zealand would do very well in our soft power index. But the limitation of smaller nations in terms of salience and familiarity definitely explains perhaps why they didn't rank as highly as we thought they would. And it's always a challenge for smaller brands, whether it's a country or a commercial brand. They're victims to this proven notion of so-called double jeopardy. They're less familiar overall. And because of that, people are less aware of their particular strengths and talents. They just don't come to mind so much. And it's not easy to counter that force. Maybe at times, smaller countries just have to be realistic about the amount of soft power and influence that they have. And we found a quote here from the High Commissioner for Singapore, which appears to say that, that pretty much kind of reflects that. It says, look, we can't really push the world around. We have to focus just on getting our own house in order. But even so, despite that kind of limitation, these two small nations punch well above their weight in terms of soft power and show what can be achieved.
Shifting our focus to more recent events, a global health crisis, and the lockdowns that have followed. With these shifts in our daily lives, a nation's ability to exercise soft power across the different pillars is changing. If you think about the UK, for example, a key way that the UK exercises its soft power is through its leadership in the area of education as one of the top destinations for international university students, a thriving culture and heritage hub where it ranks in the top 3 globally. If you think about the monarchy, the English Premier League, which all have a global following, that's one of the key avenues through which the UK exercises its soft power. With international travel, the hospitality, entertainment, and arts industry all shut down, and with physical distancing the norm for the foreseeable future, it's unlikely that these arenas will return to their original capacity anytime soon. Now, what does this mean for the ways that nations exercise soft power? This is evolving too. And we've identified 4 key pillars that are likely to take center stage going forward. Business and trade. Firstly, as with global economies in turmoil, investors and businesses are seeking stability, and they may be turning to nations that aren't the usual suspects, because many of them have been badly affected by the health crisis, which is now turning into an economic crisis. Governance, steady leadership, stability in governance has been key during this crisis. The spotlight has also been on how individual leaders have responded, and that will have an impact on the nations that are looked up to, sought out for collaboration, business, tourism, etc. International relations, so the importance of maintaining collaborative relationships for business, for aid, for sharing limited resources is also becoming apparent. Education and science, so the hunt for a COVID cure and the race to develop a vaccine has taken center stage, and the nation that does so in the next couple of years will likely have the crowning glory in this field. We will look at the impact on each of these in a bit more detail shortly, but I would just like to highlight that some of the results that we will be showing you on the next few slides are as measured in September 2019, before COVID-19 was a concern in any country. And the actual impact of the crisis will be evident in the next wave of our research this September, which will be the perfect post-event survey to reveal how perceptions may have changed. Let's first start by looking at the international relations pillar. A few countries have come into focus in this area. So the top-ranking nation last year was Germany. This year, they've been praised for successfully controlling the virus with aggressive testing and clearly attaching the appropriate importance to the pandemic and identifying and communicating that threat to their citizens early. But this successful handling of the domestic crisis has also meant that they've been able to help neighboring nations. Patients from France, Netherlands, and Belgium have all been airflown into German hospitals, an act which has earned them a lot of praise. China, being one of the first nations to have been affected and then overcome the first big wave, was able to ship essential PPE all over the world, most notably to Italy when it was at the center stage of the pandemic globally. Now, I would like to invite you to share your views on how you think the US might have fared last year and how their image is likely to change following this year's events. So you should see a poll on your screens right now. So I'll just give you a minute to have a go at voting in there. Okay, just a few more seconds. Okay, so you should be able to see the results on your screen now. So most people think that the US would have ranked within the top few nations, so within the rank 11th to 20th. That's the overwhelming majority, with a close second of people thinking that it would have ranked between 20th and 30th. And the overwhelming majority thinks that the US's rank in this area would decline going forward. Now, America actually ranked 7th last year, and when we look at their actions this year, as you know, a lot of the audience also believes, their approach has been very much about America first, and we've seen this throughout the crisis as they've tried to stop exports of PPE to Canada at the height of the crisis, to more recently, they've tried to secure the world stock supplies of remdesivir, a key COVID-19 drug, and these actions are very likely to suggest that you know, America's image in this area might decline, as a lot of the audience also seems to think.
Now, we would also expect a nation's scientific and technical resources to have quite a bearing on their success in dealing with the COVID situation. Now, if we look at who the leaders were in education and science, they're all large advanced nations, as you'd expect, although they have different strengths within that pillar to some extent. These are, you know, technological leaders with a known kind of reputation there. Note that our experts weren't quite so positive about China's performance on this pillar. It's one of the relatively few areas where there's much divergence between the expert view and the public view, by the way. In most cases, there's very strong kind of agreement on who's strong and who's weak. But the evidence in 2020 is that science and tech capabilities are not the only factors which determine a nation's ability to deal with threats like COVID-19. It's to some extent how you apply those resources. And that, of course, is a matter as much for governance and organization. And on this pillar, look at the next slide, Parul. Thanks. On this pillar, those same 5 countries have quite different rankings. The US and the UK aren't particularly well regarded in this dimension. This is before COVID-19, don't forget. And looking at how COVID's actually played out in those two, I think our survey respondents would be entitled to say, well, we told you so. Whereas Germany, with a strong science tech base and good government, ticks all the right boxes. And I guess it's no accident that they've fared better than their peers. China's a bit of a different case. You know, it's a mid-table ranking on governance, and I think that it does reflect something of a mixed feelings about the China model, regardless of how well it might have been reacting to COVID.
In the business and trade rankings, the top 5 nations deemed to have a strong and stable economy were Germany, followed by Switzerland, Canada, US, and Japan. These rankings will potentially change as several of these nations have been affected quite badly by the virus, which is leading to an even bigger economic crisis. As you can see, according to the IMF's 2020 forecast in April, all of these top 5 economies are expected to decline quite significantly and no longer seem as strong and stable. Now, I'd like to ask you another quick question to share your views on where you think Vietnam might have ranked on this particular metric. So I'll just give you. Okay, so as you would see the results on the screen, majority of respondents think that Vietnam would have come somewhere in the middle of the table. You may or may not be surprised to know that Vietnam actually ranked 57th in our study, so a lot lower than a lot of the what a lot of the audience has predicted. However, this year, the nation has also been praised for its successful handling of the virus, and it's one of the only few countries with a positive forecast by the IMF for the year. It's definitely one of the largest countries with a forecast that's as high as 2.7%. So we may expect that ranking to improve this year if Vietnam is able to leverage that. Vietnam is also an interesting example, especially when we compare it to New Zealand. So both nations have handled the crisis well and protected their economies to an extent while doing so, but both have very different soft powers. So New Zealand consistently ranks higher than Vietnam across all of the soft power metrics, including the overall rank. What this has meant is that most of the media praise and coverage has actually gone to New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern for her success as a leader in navigating the crisis. At least that's been the case in English-speaking countries and news outlets. While on the other hand, Vietnam has been one of the biggest nations without any coronavirus-related deaths, and they've actually been quite successful in using limited resources to employ them for quick strategic testing and contact tracing in order to control the spread of the virus. And that, in effect, poses a very key opportunity for Vietnam and other nations and really demonstrates the power that soft power can have. The current situation has a lot going for Vietnam, and there's lots of positives that soft power can really help amplify. And that, as has been the case for New Zealand, which due to its soft power has actually been able to benefit from their policy and strategic successes.
Well, we'll see how Vietnam fares in the next wave of research, which is coming up later in the year. For now, just a reminder that Wave 1 results can be accessed on our website, plenty there to browse and download. But we'd also welcome any suggestions and input for the next wave of research, countries to be covered, any issues or topics you think we've overlooked. This is a collaborative program, and we're keen to get input from all people and organizations. But we leave you with basically an imperative that says, whatever your interest in soft power, it is something that really does need to be understood. If you can understand it and harness the undeniable benefits of soft power, then we're sure that your business, your organization, and your country will benefit. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Steve and Parul. That was a fascinating presentation. And now we will move on to the Q&A. But before, I would like to encourage all the attendees to engage with us on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter with the hashtag softpower and the Brown Finance handle at Brown Finance on Twitter. So let's start with the first question. How can smaller nations use soft power to grow their influence internationally?
Howard, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think that question is even more relevant for smaller nations who may actually have to shout louder in order to be heard, unlike larger nations, which often have the natural draw for attention just because, you know, they're larger. If you look at nations like Switzerland, New Zealand, Singapore, which within our study actually punch well above their weight, and the soft power actually draws them significant benefits through several avenues like business, tourism, and just because they're able to leverage those strengths and use that influence on the world stage. While on the other hand, what we also often see is, you know, countries like India or the BRICS, or some of the BRICS, where, as Steve was demonstrating, who are underperforming despite being some of the largest countries and economies. So soft power really is an earned strength, and it's not really dependent on your size. And I think to an extent, it's even more important for smaller nations who may need to demonstrate better what, you know, their nations are capable of and the resources and that they possess, which soft power can help amplify. Steve, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well, I'd say.
Thank you very much, Parul. Another question. Is soft power a zero-sum game? Is it possible in theory for all countries soft power to rise indefinitely without affecting other countries' soft power?
That's an interesting question. In some elements, you could say there is a degree of it being zero sum in terms of, if you're trying to attract foreign investment, for example, you are competing with other nations. Let's face it. But in other elements, I think it's possible for one country's soft power to rise without necessarily diminishing another, particularly in the areas of things like education, science, technology. I think there is broader understanding that that many nations, for example, have strengths and expertise in a particular area that can only benefit, humankind, I would argue. And similarly, areas, for example, in protection for the environment, you would say, look, if one or two countries start to lead in this area, they're not necessarily putting others down. They're, if anything, acting as an inspiration and a role model and a leadership that allows other countries to see what good really looks like. So I don't think it's necessarily a zero-sum game, although in some cases it will be, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Another question that I think relates more with the design, the segmentation of the results. Daniel from Quebec asked if we have any studies or measure of soft power of regions, states or provinces, such as Quebec, Scotland, Wales, Flanders, etc.
Parul, I think you've done a lot of work on city and region, nation branding as well as nation branding, correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that we currently cover in any of our public studies, which focus on nations. So both the soft power study and the nation branding study that we have been doing for the last 15 years is focused on nations. However, we have done some work in the past with regions, but that's not part of sort of the public studies that we're covering, if that's your question.
Okay.
But that is something that we definitely measure and have done so in the past for different cities.
Thank you, Parul. A similar question. Could you please explain why not all the countries, not all countries are included in the Global Soft Power Index? For example, what about Belarus?
Yes, it's simply a matter of what we had room to measure, but we are hoping to expand our measurements for the second wave to include more countries in the index. It's a matter of resource and space in our survey, but we do hope that we will be expanding to cover as many as 100 countries in the next index. So if your country has not been included to date and you think it should be, please do get in touch, because to some extent, where we know that there is interest from a part of the world in being in the index, then there's a better chance of being in that expansion list, if you like, as we move towards 100 countries next time.
Okay, one more question from France. You haven't mentioned France too much today. What is your assessment of French soft power?
That's a good point, and it's not because France is weak in soft power at all. As you saw from Parul, they're very much in our top 10, and actually France does well on a number of measures. It's a bit like the UK. It's pretty well balanced and does well on most of the dimensions, but there are one or two where France really does score very well. It is number one for culture and heritage. Both the general public and the experts place France as number one on that dimension, with great food, great culture, very rich kind of heritage. So, France is certainly no slouch in terms of soft power. And I think generally shows really that still Europe overall has a tremendous kind of reach and soft power that, we might have, we were sitting here in 1947, we might have said, okay, it's the end of the European century, but somewhat 70, 80 years on, European nations still have a lot of influence and command a lot of respect, not just from their fellow Europeans, but in France's case, for example, it does very well in terms of influence and reputation in many parts of both North and Sub-Saharan Africa, where France is still very well regarded and has a lot of influence.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think one more question before we round the webinar off. How important is investing in soft power versus investment in tangible domestic policy and infrastructure in a nation?
Harold, would you like to have
Yeah.
a go?
I think the two of those really go hand in hand. Without really a strong domestic economy or any government infrastructure, it would be difficult to use any soft power for its benefits. At the same time, if a country has a lot going for it, it can miss out on some of the recognition and key opportunities that soft power may be able to help them harness on the world stage. So I think it's really the balance of the two. At the same time, it's also about identification of gaps through, studies like ours, where you're able to establish the strengths and weaknesses and a mismatch in perceptions if there is one internally or externally, or even in specific target markets. So I think using soft power to enhance existing strengths that the nation has, while at the same time identifying where the nation might need to invest within, their infrastructure and different pillars, so to say, and identifying those soft power perceptions can help do that.
Thank you very much, Parul. We need to round the webinar off as it is past 3 o'clock. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. I think it's a very fascinating subject, brilliantly presented. Our next webinar will focus on the impact of coronavirus on the sports business worldwide and will take place next week on July 16th. I would like to encourage all of you to fill out the survey upon leaving the webinar. To keep updated with future webinars, please visit our upcoming events tab in the Brown Finance Institute website. With that, I will finish. Thank you again, Parul and Steve, one more time. Thank you to all of you who joined us today, and we will reconnect on July 16th in our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.